My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 49 years old, and for most of my life, I've been the kind of man who kept his head down, worked hard, and never expected anything to be handed to me. I ran a small carpentry business in the same town where I was born, the kind of place where everybody knows your name and everybody knows your business, or at least they think they do. I had no debts, no flashy cars, and no real vices, just my tools, my work, and my quiet corner of the world. Then, one Thursday morning, my life changed forever. I won the state lottery, a jackpot so large it could wipe out generations of financial worry, and instead of shouting it from the rooftops, I decided to stay silent. The reason was simple. I'd spent years hearing relatives talk about family loyalty, about being there for each other no matter what. But I also knew how easy those words came when there was nothing to lose. I'd seen how some of them treated others when money wasn't involved, quick to judge, slow to help. I wondered what they would do if they thought I was the one in need. So I formed a plan. I would pretend to be struggling, not because I needed their help, but because I wanted to see who they truly were when there was nothing in it for them. It started with subtle hints. I mentioned to my siblings that work had been slow, that I might have to sell some of my tools. I told a cousin I'd been late on a couple of bills. The responses were telling. Some changed the subject. Some offered the kind of empty sympathy you can hear through, the kind that ends with "I'm sure it'll work out," before they quickly steer the conversation elsewhere. Not one of them asked if I needed anything. Not one of them offered to come by. So I pushed a little further. I called my brother one night, telling him my truck had broken down, and I wasn't sure how I'd make my deliveries. He sighed, told me things were tight for him too, and suggested I look into public transport. My sister, who always bragged about how close we were, didn't even return my call. I could feel my respect for them slipping away in quiet increments, like a rope fraying under tension. The hardest part wasn't hearing no, it was realizing how quickly people could retreat when there was nothing to gain. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt in the way a child might be when their family doesn't show up. I was calculating. Every reaction, every excuse, every deflection was another mark in my mental ledger. I wasn't just watching, I was keeping score. And then, when I was nearly convinced that no one in my family would step forward, it happened. My phone rang. It was my nephew, Michael, the youngest in the family, barely 22. His voice was hesitant, but clear. "Uncle Dan, I heard you might be having a rough time. I don't have much, but if you need help, I'm here." He didn't ask for details. He didn't ask what was in it for him. And in that moment I knew the truth about everyone else, and about the kind of man Michael was destined to be. In the days after Michael's call, I found myself replaying every family gathering, every casual conversation, every moment when I thought loyalty was more than just a word we tossed around at holiday dinners. I realized there had been signs all along, little cracks in the facade I had ignored, because it was easier to believe in the image of a united family. The cousin who never showed up unless there was food on the table. The sister who only called when she needed someone to watch her kids. The brother who kept tabs on everyone's business but never lifted a finger when trouble came knocking. It wasn't about the money. That's what most people never understand about loyalty. It's not the size of the help offered, but the presence of it. I would have remembered the gesture of someone simply showing up with a cup of coffee and an hour of their time. But when my calls went unanswered and my subtle cries for help were brushed aside, I knew that sentiment was just another story we told ourselves to feel good. Real loyalty doesn't vanish when times get inconvenient. Michael's offer replayed in my mind like a small light in a dark room. He didn't have much. In fact, he probably had the least of all of us. But he had something more valuable: integrity. That phone call told me more about his character than decades of family chatter ever had. And as I thought about it, I realized my little test wasn't just about uncovering loyalty, it was about finally removing the blindfold I had kept on for far too long. I began to wonder how many of my life's decisions had been shaped by the assumption that my family would stand behind me. I had taken their presence for granted, thinking that blood alone was enough to guarantee loyalty. But in the silence of those unanswered calls, I understood that the real ties aren't made in a hospital room when you're born. They're forged in the moments when someone chooses you over their own comfort. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me quiet. There's a certain stillness that comes when you stop expecting from the wrong people. It's not disappointment anymore. It's clarity. And clarity, I learned, is a kind of freedom. I didn't have to cut anyone off or start fights. I just had to stop writing their names into the spaces in my life where they didn't belong. From that day on, I decided something. When the time came to reveal what I had been keeping to myself, I wouldn't lecture them, and I wouldn't gloat. I would let the truth speak for itself, and let my silence say the rest. Because sometimes, the loudest revenge is a life lived without needing the approval or help of those who turned away when you had nothing to offer them. Once I accepted the truth about my family, my thoughts shifted from disappointment to strategy. The lottery money sat untouched in a secure account, and with every passing day, it became less about what I could buy and more about how I could use it. Not to hurt anyone, but to draw a permanent line between those who showed up when I was poor and those who vanished when I asked for help. The beauty of it was, they didn't even know they were already written into two separate lists in my mind, one that mattered and one that never would again. I started paying attention to conversations more closely. At family gatherings, I'd listen without speaking much, hearing them talk about their financial struggles, their big plans, and inevitably their judgments about other relatives. People reveal themselves when they think you're not in a position to offer them anything. And in those moments, I understood the difference between someone who will celebrate your success and someone who will resent it. The latter far outnumbered the former. Michael, on the other hand, kept showing up. He'd call just to check in, not asking questions, not fishing for gossip. One afternoon he even stopped by with a few bags of groceries. "Just in case," he said, and left before I could even offer him a cup of coffee. That small act tightened my resolve. If anyone was going to benefit from the fortune I now controlled, it would be someone like him, someone who gave without calculating the return. I began to quietly invest the money in ways no one could trace back to me. Real estate under an LLC, small businesses under silent partnerships, even a few scholarships funded through third parties. My goal wasn't just to grow the money, it was to make sure that when it was finally revealed, the structure was already in place to keep the wrong hands out. A windfall can destroy people faster than it can save them, and I had no intention of letting greed eat through my life like rot in a beam of wood. Every once in a while, I'd hear a family member complain about how no one helps anymore, and I'd have to bite back a smile. They were talking to the very person who could change their life with a single signature, and yet they had failed the simplest test of humanity. The irony was almost too perfect. But I kept my composure, playing my role as the struggling carpenter, nodding at their grievances as though I had no power at all. It wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. There would be no confrontation, no scenes, no shouted accusations. My leverage was knowing that one day, when the truth surfaced, they would realize they had written themselves out of my story, and the most satisfying part, they would never be able to blame anyone but themselves. The first signs of change were subtle. A cousin called me out of the blue, saying he'd been thinking about family unity and how we all needed to stick together more. I listened, nodding along, but inside, I knew this wasn't about unity. It was about him sensing a shift in the air. Word had gotten around that I was making connections, though no one knew exactly what those connections were. People like him can smell opportunity the way a dog can smell food from across a field. I didn't correct the rumors. In fact, I let them grow. I attended a few local business events, not as Daniel the carpenter, but as Daniel the consultant. I kept my conversations vague but confident. It was fascinating to watch how quickly people who once ignored my calls started circling back into my life. They were polite now, attentive even, as though trying to secure a place before I climbed too high for them to reach. Meanwhile, Michael remained exactly the same. No questions, no sudden interest in my whereabouts. No awkward small talk meant to fish for information. He was working 2 jobs, barely sleeping, but still finding time to check in on me. The contrast between him and the rest of the family was stark. It made my decisions even easier to make. As for the others, the quiet part of my plan was already in motion. I began to withdraw, not in a dramatic cutting people off kind of way, but in measured steps. I stopped volunteering information. I stopped attending every birthday party or barbecue. I was polite but distant, and while they thought they were slowly winning me over, the truth was they were fading out of my circle without even realizing it. Some of them were already stumbling without my help. My brother, who refused to lend me a hand when my truck broke down, had his own business loan denied. He complained to me over coffee, asking if I knew anyone at the bank. I smiled, told him I wished I could help, and meant it, but not in the way he thought. I did know someone, I just wasn't going to lift a finger. What they didn't see was that the more they had ignored me when I supposedly had nothing, the more invisible they became to me now that I had everything. And the beauty of it all was that I didn't need to do anything overt. Their own choices were the architects of their decline. All I had to do was watch quietly, patiently, and without a hint of anger on my face. It happened gradually, the way ice melts from the edges before the center even realizes it's breaking apart. My absence from their lives created a vacuum they couldn't quite explain. I was still polite when I saw them, but there was no longer any warmth in my presence, just a cool civility that told them something had shifted. They didn't know it yet, but the bridge between us was gone, replaced by an invisible wall they couldn't climb. The first real crack appeared when my sister, the one who wouldn't even return my call months ago, called me in tears. Her husband's job had been cut, and she needed help covering their mortgage until he found something new. Her voice was soft, almost rehearsed, the kind of tone people use when they're trying to sound humble but are choking on pride. I listened. I offered sympathy, and then I told her I hoped things worked out soon. The silence that followed was long enough to feel like a confession. Soon after, another cousin approached me at a local diner. He slid into the booth with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, talking about opportunities and partnerships. I nodded along, sipping my coffee, knowing full well that the last time I had asked him for a ride to pick up materials, he had been too busy. Now, suddenly, he had all the time in the world for me. I didn't confront him. I didn't bring up the past. I just let him talk until he ran out of rehearsed generosity, and then I wished him luck. Word began to spread that I was difficult or keeping to myself too much. I let them talk. They needed a reason for my distance, but none of them were willing to admit the real one. That they had failed a test they didn't even know they were taking. The truth is, I didn't have to defend myself. Their own behavior was the verdict, and I was the silent judge. Michael remained my only constant. I'd started quietly helping him behind the scenes, paying off one of his student loans anonymously, ensuring his car repairs were covered without him ever connecting the dots. He never asked for a thing, but he deserved more than I could ever repay. He had passed the test before he even knew there was one, and I intended to make sure that loyalty was honored. The rest, they were on their own. No scenes, no bitter arguments, no public declarations of who was cut off. Just a simple, unshakable truth. When I had nothing, they had nothing to give. Now that I had everything, they would get exactly the same in return. The day I decided to reveal the truth wasn't marked on any calendar. There was no grand plan for a dramatic announcement, just a moment when I realized I was done hiding, and yet had no desire to explain myself. My wealth had grown far beyond the original jackpot. Investments had multiplied, real estate deals had paid off, and quiet ventures had turned into steady streams of income. I was no longer just a man who had won the lottery. I was a man who had built a fortress with it. I chose a family gathering as the setting, not because I wanted an audience, but because it would ensure the story would travel quickly, without me needing to push it along. I arrived in a new suit, tailored but understated. The truck I drove was new too. Not flashy, but undeniably expensive to anyone who knew cars. I greeted everyone as though nothing had changed, but my presence alone drew stares. I carried myself differently now. Years of pretending to be the struggling tradesman had been replaced with quiet confidence, the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're worth. And not just financially. I wasn't there to brag. I was there to let them see what they had overlooked. When someone inevitably asked about my sudden success, I smiled and told them I'd been fortunate in business, which was true enough. I didn't mention the lottery. I didn't mention the test. The ones who had shown me nothing when I supposedly had nothing didn't deserve to know how much they had failed. The weight of their curiosity was punishment enough. But I made sure Michael knew. Later that evening I pulled him aside and told him everything. The win, the test, the ledger I had kept in my mind. He didn't say much at first, just stared at me like he was processing the size of the truth. Then he shook his head and said, "Uncle Dan, you didn't have to do anything for me." And that was exactly why I wanted to do everything for him. After our conversation that night, I could see Michael's humility wasn't an act, it was who he was. He didn't ask how much I had or what I planned to do with it. Instead, he asked how I was doing, if I was happy, if I had everything I needed. That single question told me more about his heart than any test or plan ever could. Within weeks, I began laying the foundation for his future, quietly. I bought a modest but beautiful home in his name. Not a mansion, but something solid, with good bones in a neighborhood where the value would only rise. I made sure it was paid for in full, property taxes covered for the first 10 years. I also set up a trust that would grow quietly in the background, something he wouldn't even know existed until he turned 30. Meanwhile, the family was buzzing with speculation. I'd hear snippets of conversation at gatherings, theories about how I must have landed some big client or was maybe involved in something shady. They didn't realize that their guessing was part of their punishment. I gave them nothing to confirm, nothing to deny, just polite smiles and vague responses that kept them circling the same unanswered questions. Michael's life began to change, though not in a way that drew attention. He was able to drop one of his jobs, focus more on his studies, and take his girlfriend on a vacation for the first time. I watched from a distance, not needing thanks or recognition. My satisfaction came from knowing I was investing in someone who deserved it, rather than throwing money into the hands of those who would only see it as a quick fix. And as for the others, my silence grew heavier with time. The same people who had turned away from me in my fabricated hour of need were now realizing they had no place in my real hour of abundance. Their invitations became more frequent, their smiles more forced, but my responses remained consistent, warm enough to avoid hostility, cold enough to remind them of the distance they'd created. I wasn't building walls out of anger anymore. I was building them out of peace, a peace that comes from knowing exactly where you stand and who you're standing with. And from where I stood, only Michael was close enough to hear my voice without shouting over the wall. The thing about wealth, real wealth, is that it's not about the cars, the houses, or the vacations. Those are distractions. Wealth is about control, and control is about choice. I had the choice to spend my fortune in ways that would outlive me, or waste it on temporary pleasures that would be forgotten the moment they ended. I knew exactly which path I was taking. I started small, almost invisibly. A local youth center needed repairs, so I funded them anonymously. A scholarship for trade school students quietly appeared in the name of Mercer Foundation, a name that meant nothing to most people except me. I was building a network of good, brick by brick, without ever having to put my face on it. This wasn't about attention. It was about planting seeds that would keep growing long after I was gone. Michael became part of the process without even realizing it. I'd send him on errands that were actually opportunities to connect with people I wanted him to meet, successful, grounded individuals who could guide him in ways I couldn't. Over time, he began to understand that I was nudging him toward something bigger, but he never once pushed for details. That patience and trust only confirmed I'd chosen the right person to carry the torch. The rest of the family noticed my involvement in the community, but they couldn't pin it down. They'd see my name in an article about a local event, or hear rumors that I'd been speaking with the mayor. But the details were always out of reach. I kept it that way on purpose. The more they guessed, the more they realized how far outside the circle they'd drifted. Some tried to re-enter my good graces with grand gestures, invitations to family dinners, sudden offers to help with my projects. But you can't rewrite history with a single act. Trust, once broken, isn't something you patch up overnight. I smiled, thanked them, and moved on. My ledger was still in my mind, and it wasn't going to be erased just because someone finally realized the door had closed. I was building something greater than wealth. I was building a legacy, one that didn't need their approval or participation. They had already made their choice when they turned away. And now, I was making mine. By the time a full year had passed since my so-called struggles, the separation between me and most of my family wasn't just emotional, it was structural. We were still polite in public, still exchanged the occasional seasonal greeting, but there was no depth left. The conversations were light, surface level, and stripped of the assumptions that had once made them feel entitled to my time or trust. The first ripple came when my brother's business began to fail. He approached me with a tone that carried both desperation and hesitation, explaining that a small loan could help him bridge a rough patch. The irony was painful to watch. The same man who told me to take public transport when I supposedly couldn't afford to fix my truck now sat across from me, asking for a lifeline. I kept my face calm and told him gently that I wasn't in a position to invest in other people's ventures. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The silence between us was louder than any argument. Soon after, another cousin lost her home in a foreclosure. I heard about it from someone else. She didn't call me directly. Perhaps pride kept her from reaching out, or perhaps she already knew the answer. Either way, it confirmed what I had already accepted. Our relationship was now defined by the space I had built between us, and there was no bridge back. Michael, meanwhile, was thriving. He'd been promoted at work, was excelling in his courses, and had begun talking about starting a small business of his own. I listened to his plans with quiet pride, knowing that the safety net I'd put in place would be there if he stumbled. He didn't know the full extent of my involvement yet, and I preferred it that way. It kept his progress authentic, built on his own effort rather than leaning on mine. I could sense resentment brewing among some relatives. Little comments would slip out, subtle jabs about me keeping secrets or thinking I was better than everyone else. They weren't entirely wrong. I was keeping secrets, and I had become better, not in status, but in the clarity of who deserved a seat at my table. And that clarity was something I would never give up, no matter how many whispers it caused. This wasn't about revenge anymore. Revenge fades once the heat of betrayal cools. This was about boundaries and the power of holding them firm. Once you reach that point, there's no going back. And the truth is, I didn't want. By the time the second year rolled around, the pieces of my plan were no longer scattered investments and side projects. They were a fully formed structure. Every property, every business interest, every account was organized under a trust that spelled out in exact detail who would benefit and who would get nothing. I had spent months with lawyers, accountants and advisors ensuring it was airtight, immune to challenge, and perfectly legal. If I was going to disappear from this world one day, my money would not vanish into the hands of those who failed the simplest test of decency. Michael was at the center of it all. The trust named him as the primary beneficiary, but I had designed it to release funds in stages, tied to milestones. He wouldn't wake up one morning with an overwhelming fortune. He'd receive it in increments, enough to expand his life without destroying his drive. It was protection as much as it was a gift. Beyond Michael, my legacy included the youth center, the scholarship program, and a handful of small businesses in town that would continue employing people long after I was gone. My name wouldn't be plastered on plaques or shouted in press releases. Instead, it would live quietly in the stability of the lives I had helped build. That was the kind of immortality I wanted, invisible, but unshakable. Meanwhile, the family continued to circle me like moths to a flame. They couldn't see. They still didn't know the full truth, and I still didn't offer it. Every once in a while, one of them would let their curiosity slip into a direct question. "Dan, what exactly is it you do now?" I'd smile and say, "Just keeping busy," and change the subject. Let them wonder. Let them sit in the silence. What they didn't realize was that their exclusion was no longer an act of revenge. It was a matter of design. The trust wasn't just about wealth. It was about preserving the values I wanted tied to my name. Including them in it would be like planting weeds in a garden I'd spent years cultivating, and I wasn't about to let my garden rot out of obligation. By the time my lawyers and I signed the final documents, I felt a calm settle over me. The game was over, even if they didn't know they'd been playing it, and I had won, not by defeating them, but by outgrowing them entirely. It was a late summer evening when I realized the wait was gone. I was sitting on the porch of my home, watching the sun sink into the horizon, the sky painted in deep oranges and fading blues. The air was warm, the kind that makes you linger outside just a little longer. And for the first time in years, my mind was still. There were no lingering questions, no what-ifs, no invisible debts hanging over me. The chapter was closed. The family still existed, of course. We still crossed paths at weddings, funerals, the occasional holiday dinner. But the difference now was that they no longer had the power to affect me. I didn't measure my worth by their approval, nor my success by their recognition. They were simply people I knew, connected by blood but not by loyalty, and I was fine with that. Michael sat beside me that night, telling me about his latest project, a small woodworking shop he'd finally opened. His eyes lit up as he spoke, his hands moving animatedly. I could see myself in him, not in the struggles I'd once had, but in the quiet pride of building something from the ground up. He didn't know it yet, but that shop was already protected. No matter what happened, it wouldn't be taken from him. The truth was, my greatest revenge had never been about denying anyone money. It was about reclaiming my time, my energy, and my peace. I had taken the loyalty I was denied and invested it in the one person who had offered it freely. Everything else, the whispers, the speculation, The quiet bitterness was just background noise to a life I had taken full control of. As the sun finally slipped below the horizon, I realized something important. I had turned betrayal into a blueprint, not for destruction, but for creation. And in doing so, I had built a life so solid that no one's absence could shake it. That, more than the money, was the real win. The night grew cooler, and Michael and I stayed there in the quiet, two men bound not just by family, but by choice. I didn't need to tell him everything in that moment. He would find out, piece by piece, in the years to come. And when he did, he would understand. The best victories are the ones you win without anyone ever seeing the battle. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't in proving people wrong, it's in quietly proving yourself right. I didn't cut ties with my family out of anger. I simply stopped building bridges for people who burned them without a second thought. And in their absence, I built something better. A life grounded in loyalty, protected by boundaries, and shared only with those who earned their place in it. In the end, I didn't just win the lottery. I won my freedom. And that's a prize no one can ever take away.